Hey everybody, my name is Pete Dorn and this is Spencer Smith and we're from Pareto Health. And today we're going to talk about some of the key terms in medical stop loss.
We're going to get into some fun key terms of stop loss. Yeah, I love covering these things because these are going to show up on a policy, they're going to show up on a quote, they might show up on a spreadsheet if you're a spreadsheeter, but ultimately some of these provisions that don't always have numbers attached to them are going to be really, really important to understand. So you give me your favorite.
If you're at a cocktail party and you want somebody to remove yourself from the conversation, just
you want somebody to walk away from
it.
Yeah.
Start talking about key stop loss.
This is that segment.
That's
right
correct.
here.
That's right.
Well, so how about the one I was going to touch on earlier that I think is really, really important for us to understand. We just talked about lasers. So no new lasers at renewal provision. That's kind of a mouthful, but what does that mean?
Yeah, that means that the insured, that the employer group can purchase a stop loss policy from a stop loss carrier and guarantee that they don't have any lasers at renewal.
At renewal.
At renewal, right? And for this, in most cases, they're going to pay a premium, somewhere in the, depending on the size of the employer group, anywhere between 3 and 12% additional premium, okay? Because it is an add to what they're already paying for as far as stop loss is concerned.
Okay, so no new laser at renewal.
That's correct.
Could possibly have a laser at the beginning of that policy though, correct?
That's correct.
Right, so people sometimes don't understand there's a difference, right? They'll go, well, I asked for a no new laser, but you gave me a laser. It's no new laser at renewal is the key qualifier there. So how do those work, right? If I have a laser perhaps coming in, but I have a no new laser provision for renewal, what happens there?
So the key term here is no new lasers, right?
Okay.
A reinsurance carrier, a stop loss carrier can still keep that existing laser. They can even increase it, okay?
Okay.
But as far as new lasers are concerned, so when a new risk pops on the plan during that 12 months, the stop loss carrier cannot assess an additional laser or liability on that individual going forward.
Well, that's the circumstance we say, you know, you're one hire away from a hemophiliac on your plan, right? That comes on month 3. So let's say that circumstance happens. I don't have any lasers coming in, so my policy this year has no lasers. 3 months into the plan, dependent who's a hemophiliac comes on my plan. But I did buy a no new laser at renewal policy. So what happens at renewal there?
Well, that means that that individual with hemophilia, and by the way, that's a $500 to $1 million, potentially more claimant. It's one of the higher claimants that we see in our business. Okay?
Pharmacy and ongoing,
Pharmacy
right?
and potential for emergency services,
Yep.
right? That means that that individual will not have a higher deductible because of that no new laser policy. They'll have that same specific deductible that the rest of the employees have.
Okay.
The problem is that no new laser provisions often come with the fact that they can't issue lasers, but they can increase premium to cover some of that risk. Right? So most no new laser policies are going to have a not to exceed renewal premium of, let's say, 50 to 55% on average.
And that's called a rate cap.
That's
right?
called a rate cap.
So rate cap is now going to limit the increase that a stop loss carrier can apply to my renewal. And oftentimes these rate caps and the no new laser provision are sold together, right? They tend to work together in most circumstances.
That's great. One doesn't help the employer out if it doesn't have the other, right?
Yep.
You need to have the no new laser provision with the rate cap, void of any one of those elements, and it doesn't really make sense for an employer to buy it, if you ask me.
So again, so we think about stop loss insurance, and I didn't say this earlier, but stop loss insurance is appropriately named. It stops your losses, right? So if I have a stop loss policy in place, I do have somebody like a hemophiliac join the plan mid-year. I bought that no new laser provision. They can't laser that person. I bought that rate cap that's going to limit the increase that year. So in a worst case scenario, because most people would describe that as pretty much a worst case scenario,
Correct.
I've at least hedged my risk and now I can control it year after year because I have those things in place, right?
Well, the problem with the no new laser policy, to your point, is that it's a 1-year policy. This is often a misnomer in the reinsurance to stop loss world. Okay, you're buying that no new laser policy for 1-year protection, but what happens, right? If you get that hemophiliac, if you get the multiple transplants possibility, or you get multiple cancers on the plan, the reinsurer is going to evaluate that risk and can say to you, okay, this year, right, you're going to have no new lasers and a rate cap of 50%, but I'm going to pull that option from you.
Right.
I am not going to allow you to have that next year because some of these claimants are ongoing. And so as a reinsurer, I need to make money, and while you beat me this year, you're not going to beat me in year 2 and certainly not going to beat me in year 3. So that no new laser provision often gets pulled. In fact, you asked me the stats, 35 to 40% of the time that no new laser's getting pulled at renewal.
It's getting pulled 35 to 40%
That's
of
great.
the time.
And when that happens, that employer is now exposed to lasers in the second year.
Yeah.
Okay. And so people ask me, well, I can just go buy another no new laser policy the following year. Question, what reinsurance carrier now is going to take on that known risk, right? in year number 2 and year number 3.
Yeah, I think the key distinction here is that no new laser and that rate cap provision is not in perpetuity, right? It is an annually renewable contract, which they can decide, like you said, to pull it. What happens, though, in that situation, they pull it in the worst circumstances that you can imagine. When it's absolutely something you really wanted to have, they pull it from you. You're now exposed for the following renewal. And like you said, you're probably not going to get other stop-loss carriers willing to issue that no new laser and rate cap. So you're stuck.
Right.
You're stuck exposed for the future until, for whatever reason, that risk cleans up off your plan.
That's correct. And that's why it's hard for consultants and brokers across the country to recommend a group that's, let's say, 200 lives on plan, right, to move from fully insured into the traditional self-funded model, because there is volatility in the stop-loss market, right? We've talked about the large claims. The stop-loss carriers, they're always in an effort to make money, and so when they can't make money, they're going to establish terms, to an employer which they can. And so then again, the inherent risk of self-funding is those large claims covered by the stop-loss policy, and the stop-loss policy, the ability to remove that no new laser contract at renewal and creating additional liability for
There is a solution out there that prevents that, though. I think we'll hint at that
I
here.
think we're going to
We're touch on that.
Yeah, for sure.
So, all right, so we covered no new laser provision at renewal. We covered a rate cap. How about advanced funding, Pete? What's advanced funding? Why do I need to care about that?
Yeah, well, think about the employer that comes self-funding for the first year, right? And the stop-loss contract is a reimbursable contract. You want to go back to that slide?
Yeah. The spec one? Yeah.
So the stop-loss carrier essentially is going to pay for any claim, in this case, the $50,000 over the $100,000 deductible for a $150,000 claim, okay? Technically, the employer group, without advanced funding, has to fund the full amount of that claim, right? So instead of funding up to $100,000, they're now funding up to $150,000.
Okay.
But what happens if this claimant is $500,000, right? What happens if it's a premature baby that's been in the hospital for 3 or 4 months? The baby has now come out of the hospital submits the bill, and then you're looking at $500,000. Many employers don't have the funds to take $500,000, fund the claim, and wait for that stop-loss carrier to reimburse them, okay? Therefore, we have the spec advance feature, the specific advance feature. This will allow the TPA, again, remember the cardiovascular system of the self-funded plan, okay, gets the claim, okay? The claim is $150,000. They essentially pen this claim, or they hold the claim, and they go to the reinsurer to get that $50,000 reimbursement. So essentially that employer group doesn't have to come out of pocket that full $150,000. They have to fund to the deductible. The $50,000 is paid for by the stop-loss carrier, and then once they get that full amount, of course, they reimburse the provider.
Yeah, so that's reconciled. So sometimes it's called simultaneous funding or simultaneous reimbursement. Again, stressing the fact that a stop-loss policy is a reimbursement policy, meaning the employer is technically responsible until they get reimbursed for over that deductible limit by the carrier. The spec advance feature that Pete just described limits at least either the amount of time that they're out or actually eliminates them ever having to be out the full amount and waiting for reimbursement.
So if I'm going to be an employer and I'm going to be self-funded, one of the key things I'm going to ask, one of the main questions I'm going to ask is, does my policy have specific advance?
Okay.
It must in this world, in my opinion, okay? And does my TPA have the ability to connect with my stop-loss carrier to provide that advance funding?
That's an interesting point, right? Can my TPA actually do it? And I think this is where we're getting into these key terms. Again, like a lot of people that are stuck in the spreadsheet mentality, they have these very simple Excel spreadsheets. They've got all the numbers on the page. They might have 1 or 2 provisions of the contract, but they miss a lot of these things that show up on the second or third page of the policy. Spec advance is one of those things that absolutely should be considered, that it can't be quantified in dollars, but obviously can be qualified in the value it provides.
I think consultants are compelled to look at the actual cost of the self-funding plan and the actual cost of stop-loss. But to your point, great consultants are going to look under the hood to make sure that the key elements to protect their employer, to protect their group, are in there. Spec advance is one of them.
Spec advance, yeah. Does it have X? Does it have Y? Does it have Z? So X is spec advance. Y to me is plan mirroring. Mirror, like I'm looking into a mirror. My carrier is going to give me this provision and say, I will mirror what? What is the thing that they are going to mirror on a self-funded plan?
So the official document of any self-funded plan is the plan document. Okay. That is where the employer is going to dictate what they actually want covered under their plan. Okay, and so before a TPA pays any claims, both big and small, before a stop-loss carrier will reimburse any claims over $100,000 in this example, they're going to make sure that the stop-loss policy sits over the plan document and covers all the elements in that plan document. And we never want to have something where the plan specifically calls for coverage, yet the stop loss carrier doesn't cover those specific claims. That's called a gap in coverage. So we want to make sure that the stop loss policy mirrors the plan document.
Yeah, I would look at
that
those
we have
things
no
like
gaps.
effectively those two documents now agree. The stop loss carrier is going to look at that plan document. They may not agree with all the language up front. They might ask for a review. They may even give some potential red lines. They're not going to tell you what to write, but they're going to say, hey, we're concerned about this language. But ultimately, after that review, they'll say, okay, we are going to mirror that document, assuming you've tweaked whatever they were looking at. Now those two things agree. So my stop loss policy will pay claims based on what my plan document. If they disagree, if you don't have that mirroring, the stop loss policy, if it decides that it is not covering something that the plan document says should be covered, that stop loss carrier will ultimately deny that claim.
That's
right?
correct.
That's the gap.
And that creates that gap in coverage. So again, when a consultant puts a group into a self-funding model, one of the things that you, as an employer group, you want to pay a consultant to do is to, again, go through that evaluation process. Make sure that the stop loss carrier sits appropriately over that plan document. And by the way, one of the great things about self-funding is that you can write your own plan design, so to speak, right? You can look at the plan designs, but you can decide as an employer if you want to cover things maybe that weren't covered under a fully insured plan, or exclude things that weren't covered under the fully insured plan. Anytime you have things that fall outside of the norm, you want to make sure that you get your stop loss carrier to bless that and make sure that they have that coverage.
Absolutely right. The gap in coverage is always the biggest fear. So no new laser, rate cap, advanced funding, plan mirroring. Any other terms that you think are important for somebody to know before we might move on to MGUs and GAs and things like that?
Wow, that's some of the key components there. I would think that nothing would probably get a consultant fired quicker, right, than if you have a claim that's not reimbursable and potentially a large claim that's not reimbursable under the plan document.
Absolutely. Okay. So let's move on to kind of the differences in a direct writer and an MGU with stop loss. So when I say direct writer, that's kind of the more simple thing to understand. What does it mean, a direct writer of stop loss?
Yeah, direct writer of stop loss is the relationship between the actual paper, the fronting paper, and the reinsurer, right? And so you have companies that actually, these are one and the same.
Okay.
So those taking risk, on all the big claims, the reinsurance, so to speak, is the same company as the fronting paper for these organizations, right? And so there's a number of the things that exist in a direct writing element is that they're synonymous with power, right? The ability to reimburse claims quickly because the decision-making process is one and the same.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is not a scenario where you have to get 3 and 4 decisions down the line to get a specific claim paid.
Yeah.
Okay. And
examples. So I was going to say maybe examples, right? There's a bunch of direct writers out there. You've got your Sun Lifes, you've got your Tokyo Marine HCCs, you've got your Swiss Re's, Voya, Berkshire Hathaway, things like that, where you're saying not only are they performing the underwriting functions, the sales functions, but they're also taking on the risk itself. That's what makes them a direct writer.
That's correct.
Okay.
Swiss Re, for an example, owns Westport Insurance Company, right? And that's the paper that all their reinsurance is rating on. But Swiss Re Corporate also has the reinsurance on that policy as well. So again, the relationship between the fronting paper and the reinsurer are the same. That's a direct writing.
So a direct writer is usually going to have size and scale, financial stability, streamline a decision-making process, right, especially in large claims. Contrast that, so direct writer, the other thing I referenced was an MGU, a managing general underwriter. Right. What do they do? So
this is, there's insurance companies out there that want to write stop loss, and they're not direct writing elements, okay? And so they employ a managing general underwriter. And most MGUs, right, are going to have access to write stop loss on not one carrier, but several carriers, okay? And they have the fiduciary responsibility for that carrier. They take on the underwriting responsibilities, right? They take on the claim paying responsibilities, policy issuance, all the things that a direct writer does. A managing general underwriter does the same, but they do that on behalf of several insurance companies.
Sure, it'd be like an insurance company like a Gerber or a Companion, right? They don't employ their own sales force. They're not out in the field going and selling. They're going to ask an MGU to perform those functions for them. Like you said, they have discretion, they have underwriting authority, but ultimately they're doing on behalf of somebody else, that carrier, like a Gerber, who's taking that risk. So what are some of the limitations, though, if you deal with an MGU?
Yeah, so the fronting paper, right, might be Gerber, might be Companion, but in often cases you have to employ a third-party reinsurer. Okay. Right, so those ultimately that have the risk, let's say on a claim above $500,000 or a claim above $1 million, might not be the same company as that fronting carrier. Okay. And so when it comes to paying claims, right, you have a decision-making process, right, authority from a carrier on which a claim has to be paid, right? So you have to go and get the opinion. You have to go and get the clearance in order to pay a claim. Essentially, that's above certain limitations, right? And many times there's not one reinsurer, there's multiple reinsurers, right? And so again, this prolongs the claim paying process, right? Whereas direct writers might be a week in reimbursement, most MGUs are going to be at least 2 weeks, sometimes 3 on basic claims.
Well, is it because the number of layers, right, in the decision-making process? Oftentimes they get maybe an unfair bad rep. Oh, they don't pay claims, right? Or you hear that sometimes in noise. Some of that might be just competitors trying to poke holes in them. Some of it might have an element of truth. But like, if I'm dealing with an MG, what are some questions I should be asking?
So one of the other things is the underwriting side, right? They might have to go and get permission in order to issue a policy at a certain rate, not only by the fronting carrier, again, by the reinsurers, because again, they're on the risk, right? And so the lack of flexibility as far as issuing policy, that's one. But there are great things about MGUs as well. They tend to be more nimble, so to speak.
They like specialized risk, right?
Specialized risk, right? A lot of times direct writers only write or only want to underwrite certain risks, whereas sometimes MGU might expand their horizons out a little bit further than that.
They certainly have a role to play. Everything we're talking about is sort of how do we lay this out. We're adding a little bit of our own subjectivity to it, but we're laying this out objectively so people understand these things, and they ultimately get to make a decision: should I deploy that or should I not? But you wanted to say something else, Pete. I'm sorry.
No, I think it's good. It's good competition, right? I don't know what the percentages are between direct writing business and MGU business, but there's a market for both. Okay. If you typically think about the larger cases, right, ones that are 1,000 employees plus, or deductibles that are $100,000 above, typically, the bulk of those cases are written by direct carriers.
Absolutely.
Okay. But there is a lot of market flexibility for an MGU on a smaller case, right? A group that's sub 50 employees. Okay. A lot of the direct writers don't want to be in that market, right? And so there's a need for managing general underwriters. So again, not good, bad, or different. Just different appetites.
It is. It is, right? Different appetites, different role that they play.
100%.
Before we move on to level funding, and then we'll obviously finish with some basics on captives, there's one other player in the stop loss world that I think needs to be addressed, and not to confuse MGU, there's another acronym because we love our acronyms. You have a GA, which is a general agent for stop loss. So what does a general agent do for brokers and employers?
Right. So I would classify this, and this is a big market for this in this country, for brokers or consultants that don't have the general expertise in stop loss. Okay, they can employ another company, right, a GA, to do the entire process from quoting to paying claims to looking at that policy, the plan mirroring, doing all the things that a consultant would generally do. They can hire a third party called a general agent to accomplish that. There's also fiduciary responsibility, right? As a broker, as a consultant, if you make the wrong decision, potentially that could leave you, with some legal liability. And those brokers, those general agents take that liability off the table. So there's a huge market in our country because there's a lot of brokers that are predominantly fully insured, have fully insured knowledge, but don't have that self-funded knowledge. And when that occurs, they employ a general agent, right, to help them through that
so general
process.
agent, you mentioned brokers. You didn't stutter there. That's actually, they are a broker's broker. They are
correct.
Consultant's consultant. They're an intermediary. They effectively sit between the employer, the consultant or broker, and the stop loss carrier. They become the liaison for that. They're shopping stop loss, like you mentioned. They do have some responsibility at the placement. They're accessing maybe more markets, right? They might say, hey, I've got 30 stop loss carriers and MGUs I can go to. And so they're saying, we'll take all your shopping responsibilities and placement responsibilities off your plate, Mr. Consultant or Mrs. Consultant, right? But what are some constraints, right? Because everything has an up and a downside. So if I work with a GA, what am I losing as an employer or a broker?
Well, I think it's what you're gaining, and what you're gaining is additional fees more than anything, right?
Okay.
If you're adding another party that needs to get compensated for their duties, you're also increasing, many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, increasing fees, right? And so again, if a stop loss policy through a direct writer has a fee structure of maybe 30% out of every dollar, or 30 cents out of every dollar, in a broker's broker, a general agent might have a fee structure of, let's say, 35 cents out of every dollar. And what that means for employers is less net premium to go pay for claims, okay? As long as an employer understands that, and that's perfectly reasonable.
Sure. Well, I say obviously there's a potential for higher expense loads or costs, right? There's a lot of the shopping year after year after year that goes on. All the spreadsheeting stuff we talk about. That's really a GA is offering is the ability to be masters at the spreadsheet. But they will also move stop loss year after year because they're either chasing rates, sometimes they might be chasing bonus programs and incentives that aren't necessarily aligned with the employer. Doesn't say they actually are doing that, but those incentives are out there and it is possible, right?
So again, not picking on GAs, but GA treats stop loss more of a commodity,
Sure.
right? More of a life insurance rate or a dental rate or things of that nature. Okay, whereas potentially consultants that have a relationship with their reinsurer directly, might make different decisions as it pertains to risk.
Sure, and you mentioned the last thing that I will stress is there's a layer now in between. We talked about MGUs being a layer in between the paper and the broker. Now you potentially have a GA who's accessing an MGU. Now you have multiple people on behalf of that employer who's at the end of the day just trying to decide what's best for them, right? And so lack of visibility, a bunch of decision makers intervening on their behalf, and not a lot of control that they now have over the outcome itself. So GAs exist for a reason. Like you said, they've proliferated throughout the country. There's a reason they exist, but everything again has some sort of limitation, or when you look at it in totality, you might decide, well, maybe that's not for me because of X, Y, and Z. And so that's what we're trying to do here. Before we move on to level funding, anything else you want to add on the role of the general agent or circumstances around using them?
No, they're widely popular, because people are smart enough, consultants are smart enough to realize, brokers are smart enough to realize that when we don't have the expertise, we're going to employ somebody that does.
Somebody does.
But at the end of the day, consultants don't want the responsibility of mishandling stop loss, right? And the potential is there for them to do that. They're going to take that off their plate by employing a broker's broker.
Yeah, it makes sense, yeah. All right, so let's move on to level funding, Pete, and then